Good afternoon. Muy buenas tardes. It's an honor to have you here tonight, here at Instituto Cervantes in Sydney. Wrapping up our cultural program for 2024, we couldn't finish with a better activity. In this case, we have the honor to host Luke Stegmann's launch of his book, Madrid, a new biography. It is wonderful to have Luke Stegemann here once again with us in Instituto Cervantes. If I may, I would like to begin with the acknowledgement of country. As Instituto Cervantes here in Sydney acknowledges the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting. I pay my respects to the elders past, present, and future, and the Aboriginal elders of the other communities who will be here today. It is an honor to have with us in Instituto Cervantes in Sydney, Luke Stegemann, as we have a long-lasting collaboration with Luke, as he is one of the best Hispanists here in Australia. It is an honor as well because we're hosting the launch of his book about my hometown, Madrid. And we are hosting the launch of the book in its original version, English, as the first book launch was of the translation of the book Madrid, una ciudad de éxito. So it was a different title in Spanish. A short introduction for those who, very few, will not know our guest here today. Luke Stegemann, as I said before, is one of the most acclaimed Hispanists here in Australia. He has also been the author. He is also the author of books that talk about the relation amongst Spain and Australia. The Beautiful Obscure, published in 2017, and Amnesia Road in 2021. They had many awards, and one of the awards that Luke has been given that I would like to underline is the Malaspina Award, given by the Spanish Embassy, as well as SRAP and Navantia in 2018. This award is given to those who promote and to help build bridges with Spanish and Australian culture to get to know each other. That is essential in the line of work that we do here in Instituto Cervantes, as our mission is to promote not only Spanish language, but Hispanic culture. The more that we know about each other, the better we understand each other. That is our main goal, so it's obvious that Luke is one of our best collaborators. The book Madrid has been ongoing, has received many reviews, and I'm just going to point out a few. In Spanish reviews from El ABC, from El País, El Confidencial, La SER, Onda Cero, Telemadrid, and international reviews, The Times, in The Economist, Wall Street Journal, the blog Tyler Cohen, who recommended this book as one of the best nonfiction books in 2024, Sydney Morning Herald, and Australian Book Review. As you can see, there has been a lot of reviews, so that is, with no doubt, a reflection of how good this book will definitely be. Well, without further ado, our goal here today is to talk about Luke and to talk about the book. I'll try to be as unbiased as possible, but I love the idea, and you have to read the book because it's definitely worthwhile, of an Australian talking about Madrid with so much love and in the most neutral way, because we also talk about Madrid as a wonderful city with its ups and downs, but it's incredible to hear about an Australian know so much about this city, and it's incredible to have an Australian talk in such depth of this city where not so many foreigners have been able to attempt to talk about Madrid in this depth. If we may, I would like to start with a couple of questions.
Please,
and the floor
please.
is yours. It's you we want to hear. Um, First question goes without saying, how come it's an Australian that writes one of the first books in English made in Madrid, about Madrid, with its major social, cultural, and political history of Madrid?
Thanks, Coral. And can I also say, before I start, thank you very much. It's always such a pleasure to be here, and I always feel like I'm well and truly at home. And thank you so much for always inviting me and hosting me here. Well, why is it an Australian who's done this? I guess, if I say so myself, pioneering work in the English language about Madrid. It's because Madrid's a city that I've known and loved for many years, and I guess probably 7 or 8 years ago, when I started to think about the idea of writing this book, it's not so much that I wanted to write a history of Madrid. I just thought I wanted to find some way of sort of paying homage to Madrid, because it's not just a city that I like. It's a city which has had a big impact in my life. You know, my first sort of 5 or 6 years in Spain, which was spent in Madrid, are years that really changed my life. They changed who I was as a person, and so I began to, I understood and spoke Spanish and so on, and it just completely opened up a whole new world. And so that experience really began in Madrid. And so I thought, well, I want to pay homage in some way. How would I do that? And I started thinking about, I went back over my notes when I'd finished writing the book, and I realized I started writing in about 2016, 2017, around the time that I published The Beautiful Obscure. I got sidetracked then into the issue of democratic and historic memory, and I wrote Amnesia Road. And then when that was out, I then thought, I've got to get back to that book about Madrid. And I realized that there was really almost nothing in English about Madrid. And I thought, well, first of all, that's good and bad. It's bad because it tells you that, this city's been terribly neglected. But it's also good because there's an opportunity for me there, And I've got to say, in the 3 years or so then that I seriously sat down researching and writing the book, I woke up every morning thinking, I'm going to find out today that someone else has, beaten me, and they've just published this great book about Madrid. But it just didn't happen. It didn't happen. And so my book came out. I guess the fact that, that it's an Australian who does it, that's a very, very interesting question. I mean, we could talk about that for a long time. Why has no English person or American person written this kind of book about Madrid? There have been a lot of great books written in English about specific artists, so Velázquez, Goya, etc., or about specific moments in history, so particularly the Second Republic, the Civil War, the court of Philip IV, or El Escorial and Philip II. So those sorts of periods have been written about specifically, and there are people who are great specialists in those areas. But as for writing a whole general history, which goes right back to the very beginning, no, that hadn't been done. So I guess I was there, and I thought, I'm going to do it.
It was good you were there first.
And I've got to say, there are some times when you're writing a book, sometimes where it gets a little bit tough. There were once or twice where I thought, have I taken on more than I can handle here? But I don't think there was ever a point where I thought, I don't want to do this. Never. I found it really exciting. I thought I know the city pretty well. But then I did serious research, and my vision and understanding of the city has just changed and deepened much more through all of that. Yeah.
I would like to talk about that research.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
When and where did you find enough materials enough to be able to do that research? Because it took some time.
It did. And keep in mind, there's not much material available in English. So I went to Spanish sources principally, which logically enough, I think that's the place to go. It's interesting, because I found if I can just sidetrack a moment and say, when I was writing Amnesia Road, and a lot of that stuff was about the past and traumatic memories and so on, I found that my understanding of, let's say, the last 100 years of Spanish history became much more nuanced the more Spanish sources I read. You know, I found that a lot of the English language sources were fairly one-sided and fairly predictable, and I sort of started getting a much more 180-degree view of things the more Spanish sources that I read. So I was perfectly happy to go to the Spanish sources. Now, what happened, of course, was as I was starting writing the book, COVID began, and so for 2.5 years, I wasn't able to visit Spain, and so I relied on my own memories of my many, many years of living in the city or visiting the city, and then I just started to look at what online resources were available, and obviously the library of the Instituto Cervantes of course, is a magnificent resource, but also places like the Institute of Madrileña, Instituto de Estudios Madrileños, which is in I think in the Complutense University in Madrid, is an absolutely magnificent resource because they publish, they have annual conferences about specific themes. So Madrid and Santa Teresa, or Madrid parks in Madrid, or parks and rivers in Madrid, or Madrid of Felipe IV, and so on. These specific things, and then there'll be 20 papers all about that, 500 pages of content, and those were a really, really rich source of material, very, very rich. And you know, there's a lot of people doing a lot of very, very interesting research into, of course, the history of Madrid, but also the urban evolution of Madrid, how the actual urban landscape and the different kinds of lifestyle, how that has evolved over the centuries. And so, yeah, there's so much stuff available. But it was wonderful when, after COVID was over, and it was nearly 3 years I'd been away, and when I'd basically been reading about Madrid non-stop for 3 years, when I finally went back to Madrid, it was, great. It was like going back to an old friend who suddenly you knew them much better than you did before. Yeah.
So that's why, for us, Instituto Cervantes, with the mission to promote Spanish language and Hispanic culture in English-speaking countries, it's not that easily.
Yes.
It's not that easy to find English books in such depth.
Yes.
So it's definitely a promotion of the city, a promotion of the culture, and to be honest, yeah, it's been neglected, shall we say?
It has been.
And so this is a great issue for us.
Can I just say one thing about that? There's a kind of there's a real perception, I'd say, amongst a lot of Anglophone writers or commentators on Spain that you know, the most interesting place in Spain is Barcelona, you know, and Madrid. Oh, that's that sort of conservative place, you know. And this is all completely wrong, of course, completely wrong. But there's been that kind of tendency to think, well, you know, the interesting things in history happened elsewhere, and there's been a lot of focus on Barcelona, to an extent, parts of the Basque countries, parts of Andalusia, and so on. And yeah, Madrid's kind of, I mean, I talk in the book, I start off by talking about how Madrid's just been characterized as this sort of ugly, barren, sterile, dirty place in the middle of the Iberian Peninsula. That's just completely wrong. Madrid is this magnificent and beautiful city. I mean, it has really changed a lot over the last, particularly 20, 30 years, in terms of sort of cleaning itself up and new architecture, and it's a much more spectacular city now maybe than it was 30, 40 years ago. But you're right, there's, you know, we talk about the neglect of Madrid has been part of a kind of in terms of the sort of historiography, so the historical writing about Spain and its politics, Madrid has kind of been neglected because it's been associated with reactionary governments and so on. And so people have, we don't really want to write about that. And they had Madrid completely wrong, of course.
Myself as a Spanish citizen, and I am from Madrid, but I must say that, yeah, there's many beautiful places in
Mm.
Spain. Barcelona is wonderful. The
Mm.
northern part of Spain is wonderful,
Mm.
and Andalusia, of course. But it's an honor for an Australian author such as yourself to write with such knowledge and depth of Madrid. You have mentioned this swiftly before. So Madrid is the paradox of the city with conservative or usually conservative governments, but also with radical social movements.
Yes, yes. This is one of the things that's interesting, and this is part of the greatness of Madrid because it's able to contain all of these things. You know? And I mean, Madrid, since it was the seat of the royal court from the 16th century, obviously a series of absolutist governments, and then through a series of fairly reactionary military governments throughout the 19th century, then a sort of dictatorship light at the start of the 20th century, then the Second Republic, you know, the Franco dictatorship and so on. So Madrid, and then at the local level, that is at the municipal level and the regional level, Madrid has also often had conservative governments. There have been some left-wing governments, but it's mostly conservative right-wing governments. But that doesn't mean that all the people in Madrid are conservative or right-wing. Far from it, far from it. One of the most important political phenomena of the last 15, 20 years or so in Spain is a political party called Podemos, which basically came out of Madrid. They came out of the universities in Madrid. And so, you know, there are these, and of course there were other radical social movements going back in the 19th and 20th centuries. I mean, the PSOE, the oldest political party in Spain, was founded in the Casa Labra, just in the centre of Madrid, in I think it was 1879. So there is this predominance of sort of conservative governments, but there's also this very, very strong undercurrent of radical social movements as well. And Madrid contains all of those. That's part of its greatness. It's not one thing or the other.
No, it's definitely. Madrid, you mentioned Madrid is reborn
Yes.
several times.
Yes.
During the history of the 1,200 years you're talking about in your book. What would be the key point of this being reborn?
I think when you visit Madrid, you see sort of different bits and pieces from different eras, and I think you need to understand the history to sort of see how it all fits together. Right? If we think of some of the times when Madrid has changed radically, and every time there's a big change in Madrid, a lot of existing architecture gets knocked down, and think the city's kind of rebuilt again and again. And that goes right back to the Islamic foundation in the year 865, roughly, when this little kind of Visigoth settlement actually becomes an Islamic fortress, a defensive fortress in the center of Spain. And so that changes the nature of the town. Then Madrid becomes a Christian city in the late 11th century, and the town changes again. Then it becomes the capital of Spain in the 16th century, and it changes again. And then there's a series of in the 17th century, Madrid's this fantastic Baroque city. It has this incredible collection of Baroque buildings, mainly religious buildings, but not exclusively. A lot of private palaces, but you know, monasteries, convents, churches, and so on. A lot of that, we look at, there's a very famous map of Madrid, was done in 1656 by a Portuguese cartographer called Pedro Teixeira, and he was commissioned by King Philip IV to do this map of Madrid. It's the most beautiful artifact object. It's still preserved in the museum, the Municipal Museum of Madrid, and if you look at that map, you can see this vast array of Baroque architecture throughout Madrid, about 85% of which is no longer there. It's been lost, and a lot of it was lost in the early 19th century when French forces under Napoleon invaded Madrid as part of their invasion of Spain, and they destroyed a lot of buildings. And then Napoleon's brother Jose, who was the king of Spain for a short period of time, he drove through a whole lot of architectural reforms through Madrid, and he wanted to make it more. They had this more sort of French grandeur. They thought Madrid, it's all too cramped and everything's too close together, and we need to just open up some spaces here. And you look at it now and you think, well, it was probably a good thing. But he created some of the most famous plazas or squares in Madrid. But at the time, they were knocking down, beautiful old convents and monasteries and so on to create those plazas. And now that those, like the Plaza de Santa Ana, which is one of the most famous in Madrid, most people probably don't realise that used to be a convent of Santa Ana and was founded by Ana de Jesus, a close friend of Teresa of Avila. So I don't think that, each time stuff gets knocked down, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. There's been this continual progress. Then Madrid suffered terribly during the Civil War. Again, bombardment. And then during the first 20, 30 years or so of the dictatorship, there was a lot of just knocking down stuff and building that kind of very functional, kind of dull-looking mid-20th century high-rises and so on. Lots and lots and lots of that. So there were times when you thought there were areas of Madrid which were really quite ugly. But little by little, those things have just settled in and become part of the landscape. And of course, now in the 21st century, the city is experiencing this astonishing financial boom, which is translating into an architectural boom as well. So new style skyscrapers and cultural buildings going up around the city as well. There's also been a lot of redevelopment. So there was an old area down the river, the Manzanares River, which was for many, many years a sort of fairly stinky, rotten kind of river. People always made jokes, even going right back to, was it Lope de Vega, or one of those Golden Age poets made joke about how pathetic the river in Madrid was. But about the last 20, 30 years, it's all been completely redeveloped.
It's beautiful, yes.
It's been gardens placed everywhere. There was a motorway that went right through the middle. They buried that, put it underground, they put parks, and then there was an old abattoir, the Matadero of Madrid, which has become a major cultural centre. So initiatives like that have happened all over Madrid in the last sort of 20, 30 years. So making it a really, really, it's always been a very exciting city, but even more so now.
Yeah, they're taking care of that. Now they're trying to boost and promote all the cultural activities as a cultural capital in Europe. And I've lived the process of all those changes and what it entails, as in traffic jams, as I know what they're going to do here now and that. But definitely, there's a before picture and an after picture. The Manzanares part is incredibly different, and it's as I said before, like the promotion and the taking care of the culture.
Absolutely, it's Madrid has to be one of the most culturally one of the most vibrant cities in Europe, if not the world, these days. Absolutely.
I'm sorry, but I have to ask this. It's incredible to hear an Australian talking about La Movida. Can you explain what La Movida is?
Yeah, look, I only caught the end of it, but look, La Movida was a cultural movement that exploded in Madrid after the end of the Franco regime. And as I say in the book, this stuff, all these new, and it basically, because it was late 70s, when it really began, it obviously took a lot of its aesthetic styling from punk and new wave movements that were happening in London and New York at the time, and Sydney and Melbourne and so on. So let's not forget that Sydney and Melbourne were very much a part of that as well. And so it was just this explosion of, what the hell, just anybody do it. You want to do it, go and do it. Play in a band, create art, make film, open a club, whatever. It was just go and do it. And there's just
dress as you like.
So dress as you like, absolutely. Dress as you like, sleep with whoever you like. And so it was just this kind of crazy explosion of culture. And it lasted probably 8 years, 10 years, something like that. But it completely changed elements of the cultural landscape in Spain, because it was kind of this way of radically opening up again to the world and saying, wow, here we are, and we can do things as vibrantly as anyone else. And it's interesting because I say in the book how it didn't just come from nowhere, right? La Movida was, there'd been a lot of sort of countercultural activity going on in Madrid, particularly in the last 10, 15 years, of the dictatorship during the 1960s, and student protests and alternative, music and so on. It was all going on a little bit underground, and then suddenly there was the opportunity to bring it out into the open, and it just exploded. So this cultural movement, it happened in other places, but it was mainly based in Madrid, and so Madrid got that reputation as being the home of that. And of course, a lot of those people, like a firework, had exploded and then just disappeared, and it was that kind of very ephemeral. But probably, of course, the most famous person to come out of that movement was Pedro Almodovar. Yeah, and he very much documented in his film. His early films are very much a reflection of what was going on in Madrid at the time.
Yeah. It was a real shock for those that had seen the previous cultural activities, films, books, and suddenly Pedro Almodovar was like, oh my God, they're actually doing whatever they feel like, they're dressing however they feel like, and doing whatever they want. And there was actually certain places in certain areas in Madrid that represented that, right?
Very much so, very much so, yeah. Well, I mean, there was a couple of, the inner Madrid suburb of Malasaña was very famous. The area of the Rastro was famous as well in La Movida, and a little bit the area of Prosperidad as well. And one or two other places, but yes, no, it was all around. And like when I got to Madrid in the mid to late '80s, there was still a bit of that happening. I mean, I suppose purists would say, "Oh, well, you missed not you missed." I mean, I lived those kind of years here in Sydney as well, But if perhaps the greatest explosion of the Movida had died down, nevertheless, cultural life was just astonishing when I got to Madrid. Just astonishing. The amount of music, photography, art, bars, just people gets all night going on all the time. It was just, and to be there when you're in your mid-20s was just fabulous.
It's great.
Yeah. So you see how I fell in love with Madrid.
Good.
I fell in love with Madrid as a young man, and now as an older man, I'm still very much in love with the city, even though it's changed completely.
It's changed, definitely. A very good friend of mine, Australian, went to Madrid for tourism. That's one of the main reasons also Madrid has opened up so much. And he actually said, where are all these people going? Non-stop, 2 a.m., 3 a.m., 5 a.m., 5 p.m., anytime. What is everybody doing in the center? Of course, not outside in the outskirts.
Yeah.
But what are they doing? There's always something to do if you'd like. And yes, we also maybe because of the heat or because of our custom, but we are used to having a nightlife because during the day it's very hot. So it's you can. So an Australian can wake up at 5 a.m. to go to do sport. They're very sport. But Madrileño at 5 a.m. is finishing the last concert, the last song, and so it's definitely.
Well, it's funny. It's funny that because I remember, going to a nightclub and arriving somewhere at 3 a.m. and the place was empty, and you think, oh, this place is pretty dead. And they say, no, it hasn't really gotten going here yet, And different places were famous for being at different times. This place really kicks off at 5 a.m. to about 8 a.m. That's its time. And then everyone moves on to somewhere else. So you turn up there at 2 or 3 a.m. No, it's dead. There's nothing there. You've got to be there at 5 a.m. Whereas there were a couple of other places. Well, that's where you had to be at 2 a.m. or 3 or midnight or whatever. Yeah.
And if you want to have dinner in a great restaurant, nothing to do with Australian time. What time?
No. Well, from 10 o'clock onwards,
from
really.
10 p.m. onwards.
Yeah.
Definitely. Talking about Madrid today, you mentioned before the museum, Prado Museum. You said it to be one of the most concentrated and brilliant art collection in the world.
Not one of the most, no, the most.
The most,
yeah. That was, I was quoting there, it's going to escape me now, I think it was Antonio Saura, who'd said that, yes, the Prado Museum, it's not the biggest art collection in the world, but painting for painting, it is the most brilliant collection in the world. There's not a dud in the whole museum. It's not as big as the Louvre or the Hermitage, but and the origin of that collection was basically the Spanish royal family's collection for hundreds and hundreds of years, And it wasn't just Spanish artists. It was because the Spanish, the Habsburg dynasty ruled in Spain for 200 years. And so there was an enormous influx of Flemish art, Italian art, German art, French art, and at the same time, Spanish artists were going out to those places, particularly to Italy, to study new techniques and so on. And so there was this great exchange of art from all around Europe, and at the same time, at the height of the Spanish Empire, or the wealth of Spain as a nation, King Philip IV, Philip II to an extent as well, and Philip III, but particularly Philip IV, would send ambassadors out and say, listen, go around, buy up whatever you can, buy as many paintings as you can, because look, we've got this. Philip IV built this big, like kind of pleasure complex on the eastern side of Madrid called the Palace of the Buen Retiro, and when it was completed, he had all these walls that needed to be filled with artwork, and so with tapestries or paintings, and so he commissioned. Well, it's funny. First of all, he had his right-hand man, the Count Duke of Olivares, who was a very famous 17th century statesman. He had him basically go around all the nobility saying, hey, how about you give us some of those paintings, kind of basically strong-armed them into giving up some of their best paintings for the royal collection. And then he sent other people, like Velázquez was one, most famously. He said, go out to Italy, just whatever you think is good work, just buy it up and ship it back. So you have that sort of happening for a couple of hundred years. You gather an astonishing collection of art, and quite eclectic as well. It's why you have the most extraordinary collection of Hieronymus Bosch paintings in the world is in the Prado, the greatest collection of El Greco, and of course of Goya and Velázquez and so on, and many Rubens as well, because he worked at Titian. He worked for Philip II. Rubens worked for Philip IV. And so it's really, really fabulous. And because of that very close connection between Spain and Italy, I mean, Naples and Sicily being part of Spanish possessions for hundreds of years as well. So this very, very, very rich art collection developed, and that formed the basis of what is the collection at the Museo del Prado. Yeah.
Did you know that it's one of the mandatory topics that you have to study in the last year of school, just before university, is Historia del Arte?
Okay.
Do you know that the majority of the students, it's an optional, but it's very common. We all have to study that, the history of Spanish, Italian, and artists.
Well, that's great. Yeah. That's great. I wish that existed in Australian high schools, where you have to study art history. I mean, I work in a school, and they teach art there. And I say to them, do you ever learn any art history? No, we don't do that. No. So anyway, but look, history as a subject is in real trouble in schools, unfortunately. Never mind art history, that's really,
It's a different
those specialities like ancient history, art history, that's really hard these days to get them up, yeah.
You mentioned in the book that Madrid will be one of the megalopolis of the Iberian Peninsula. How's that?
Yeah, that's not actually in the book. That was with an interview that I did. But just in case anyone's thinking, where has he written that?
Sorry.
No, that's all right. That's all right. No, it's an interview with a Spanish journalist who was talking about another Spanish urban geographer who's written this piece about how Madrid is kind of destined to become the first megalopolis on the Iberian Peninsula, and it'll be the first, and probably will be the only one, because if you think what city on the Iberian Peninsula could grow to the size of Rio de Janeiro or Tokyo, or one of these places with let's say 12 to 15 million people, right? The only place realistically that could happen is in Madrid. It won't happen in Barcelona because the geography is all wrong. It won't happen in the south of Spain. It won't happen in Lisbon. So Madrid I think is destined, and I think that will happen. Over the next probably 30 to 50 years. I think Madrid is just going to keep growing and growing, and it does have room to grow. Now, water, sustainability, these are also always issues, but Madrid does still have room to grow. the region, the community of Madrid still has a lot of space. Some people living there might argue with that, but it's hard to see. Madrid is experiencing this enormous growth that it has done over the last few decades, and it's hard to see that changing. It's becoming such a reference point as a city, particularly for people from South America and South and Central America. It's the connections with Venezuela, particularly, and Cuba, and so on. It's really Argentina, of course, as well. There's this really, really strong cultural and capital flows moving to Madrid, of course, from Miami as well. That's the other. Miami's kind of like a second sort of Madrid in some respects, in terms of the financial and cultural connections. So, that's just the way Madrid is growing. The question, I think, is how it handles that, and that's a real issue. That we speak to the mayor about, and other people like that, local politicians. But no, I think that's going to happen. I can't see Madrid. I can't see the growth stopping. Not for a while, anyway. Not for a while yet.
You mentioned the mayor. You actually had the mayor of Madrid back in Spain in July in the launch of your book, in the translation of the book, right?
Yes.
And he talked about about the Megalopolis and how Madrid is growing and is trying to absorb that constant growth.
Yes. Absolutely.
Of the city.
No, that was a wonderful event. I'll just say, just briefly, so people understand, the Spanish edition came out before the original version, which was kind of an unusual thing.
Why was that?
What happened? Well, basically, I was sitting at home thinking, I'll spend another year and a half, 2 years writing this book, and then one night I got an offer to publish the book from a Spanish Espasa, a major Spanish publisher. Oh, how long will you take until you finish the book? Maybe 2 years. And they said, listen, this is our timeline. You've got 5 months to get it finished to meet our deadlines. And I said, gulp, right, okay. And so I basically sort of gave up everything else in my life apart from work and got the book finished. So they had this idea that they wanted to. I handed the book, obviously in English, to both the UK and US publisher, Yale University Press, and to Espasa in Madrid. So they all got the book on the 1st of October, 2023. And then Espasa, Yale were just working off their own. They said, we're going to publish it next August. Okay, that's fine. And they've been absolutely superb to work with. Espasa also were great, but they said, look, we want to bring this book out in May, June to coincide with the Madrid Book Fair. And they said, we want you to come over and be at the Madrid Book Fair. We'll launch the book, which made absolute sense to go over it and do that. So it was translated by a fabulous Spanish translator called Ana Bustelo, and she translated the book. It took her about 3 months, and we backwards and forwards on different things. And I've got to say, Anna was fabulous in the number of mistakes that she picked up. She said, are you sure you mean to refer to this person? I said, oh, I'm pretty sure. No, I think you mean this person. And honestly, I was astounded. She said, because if you look at this book on page 712, footnote 3, it says, yeah, right, okay, I'm not going to argue. A level of detail, level of knowledge was astounding. Really, really fantastic. Look, there weren't a lot of errors, but inevitably there were some. You can't write a book like that without making a few sort of little mistakes on people's names or dates or stuff. And it was fabulous to have. I felt really, really confident because the translation was done while they were still finalising the editing on the Yale book. I said to my Yale editors, this is great. We're basically getting it all fact-checked by Spanish people before we're actually having to finalise it, which is just really, really good. I'll try and do that for the next book as well, if that happens. But yeah, so that's why it came out in Spanish first. And look, and I was at I had an invitation to meet the mayor of Madrid to presenting the book, and at that meeting I went along with my publisher and my editor, and he said, listen, do you have anyone who's going to launch the book? And we still hadn't decided at that time, and he very kindly offered to do that. So we had a great event I think it was on the 1st of July in the Retiro
Yeah,
Park,
Retiro.
which is just such a fabulous part of Madrid, and the mayor launched it, for which I was very grateful. Yeah,
It was wonderful, definitely.
it
I
was. Yes,
I was
Coral
glad to
was
be
there
I
actually
was
that night. She was there. It was
I was on
fantastic.
vacation visiting my family, and when I found out, I said, "Look, Mom, Dad, I have to go and see this. I'll be back in a bit." Oh, it was wonderful. But
It was a great.
it was great to see, and the book being launched in Madrid in Spanish, and I
Yes.
was like, "What about the original version?" And you were
Yeah.
like, "No, that's not ready yet." It's okay, okay. We'll wait for that later
Yes. Yeah.
on. You talked about the modern idea of Madrid. When does that idea of the modern Madrid, do you think, settle in?
Oh, I think really in the early part of the 20th century. I think Spain has a very, very difficult, from a political point of view, has a very, very difficult 19th century. There were 3 civil wars during the 19th century. It's funny because people talk about the Spanish Civil War. They refer to the one in the 20th century. They don't really know about the fact there were 3 civil wars in the 19th century, and very damaging civil wars. And really, Madrid in the first decades of the 20th century, particularly around the 1920s, 1930s, and this is something that I kind of knew, but I really found out a lot more about in researching the book. There was a collection of artists, writers, thinkers, scientists, philosophers, just creative people, or people just doing things differently in Madrid in the 1920s and 1930s, which is just incredible, the list of people. And then when you read more about the cafe styles and the things that they were doing, you realise this was equally to compare to Belle Epoque Paris or Weimar Berlin or any of those more famous places in the 20s and 30s in Europe. Madrid really had it all going on in the 20s and 30s. There was this astounding collection of people. And there was this place called the Residencia de Estudiantes. It was a students' residence at the university, and it was where, for example, that's where Luis Buñuel, Salvador Dali, and Federico Garcia Lorca all met. So those, and that's just 3 names, but there were plenty of other famous names at that time. Maruja Mayo, a fabulous painter. The list just goes on and on and on. And yes, so I think that kind of idea of Madrid as a modern place begins there. And I think that kind of stops for a while, though, during the middle of the 20th century, as sort of things sort of closed down for obvious reasons. But then that really, as I say, it's if you think about the movida that we talked about in the 70s and 80s, in some ways that's kind of an extension of what was happening in the 20s and 30s. It's kind of like that. It's the roots are there, It's not this thing just suddenly came from nowhere. All those cultural roots are there. They've just been lying dormant for sort of 20, 30, 40 years, but they came springing back out again.
Everything was under control. Nobody could,
Yes,
do
yes.
something or shouldn't do something out of the ordinary, and suddenly, just outburst. You can just watch one of the first films of Almodóvar, and you can easily see.
Well, it was
that.
like suddenly there's no rules anymore.
Suddenly,
Yeah,
there's no rules.
yeah.
Following this idea of Madrid past, present,
Yep.
I would like to know what is in your mind in the near future, because I know you're something is going on with that head of yours. I know you're going to, because before we started, he was looking at a lot of books from Instituto Cervantes library, and he was taking out a
There
couple
were.
anytime.
I'll be honest with you. There were times when I was writing this book, and I loved writing this book. It was just fabulous. But nevertheless, there were times where I thought, I'm not going to write another book after this one. It's just, much as I enjoyed it, but I thought, well, it's, I'm not one of these people who feels I have to always be writing. I'm not. I actually prefer reading to writing. Honestly, I love reading, and I'd love to spend much more time reading. But no, it's been part of writing this book. I was particularly fascinated with the 16th and 17th centuries in Spain, and it has this kind of this label of the golden age in Spanish, el siglo de oro, and I thought, again, this is something where I think a lot of stuff that I've read about this, it kind of all seems to be kind of a bit the same, the sort of the take on it and the approach to, this period of all these incredible painters and incredible writers, and they were almost all, not all of them, but 80 to 90% of them were all based in Madrid, because that's where the royal court was, that's where patronage was. And I think there's been an idea of treating this period as kind of like almost like an exceptional thing that suddenly happened, and then it all suddenly disappeared, and the Spanish Empire collapsed, and that was the end of it. And then Spain sort of went into darkness. This is all complete nonsense. And so I'm interested in, again, we're talking about where the roots of cultural movements lie, and I'm interested in some of my reading. I've been coming across these extraordinary female poets of the 15th and 14th centuries that I'd never heard of, and probably not many people have heard of them. Well, there's something going on here. There's a lot more cultural life and vibrancy happening pre, let's say, the discovery of the Americas, early 16th century. Pre that time, and then when we come to the end of the 17th century, the Habsburg dynasty finishes, the Bourbon regime of dynasty begins, and there's this idea that all great Spanish artists, they sort of died off by the end of the 17th century. The last of the great ones was Velázquez or Murillo or one of those. But in fact, if you have a look at the painters who continued on in the 18th century, they were all fabulous, not to mention, of course, Goya. And then all these painters, from El Greco to Ribera to Velázquez, and so had this incredible influence on European and American art in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And they had an extraordinary influence. And so I'm interested in this period, and I think it needs to be rewritten. I think it needs to be completely and freshly looked at and completely rewritten with a kind of, and with a, as you know, I'm not an academic writer. I love the anecdote. I love the human story. I love the incident. I love the colour. I don't like so much the trade statistics and stuff like that. So I avoid that kind of history. But I think it's this period of time with this incredibly colourful array of characters, and of course beyond all the famous. I've mentioned the painters, but the writers, Cervantes and Lope de Vega and Quevedo and Calderón de la Barca, Tirso de Molina, and all these names. Beyond those, there's all these other categories of names as well, who people in Spain would know them, or specialists would know them, but outside of the Spanish world, I don't think they're known at all. And some of these names are crying out to have some of their work discussed, translated, analysed, put in a historical context, and they're just, these people's lives were really incredible, full of the most, crazy incidents, and also it's just a challenge, I think, for me to try to get. I think you've got to completely do away with your current mental frameworks, and you've got to try and go back and interpret that period in a completely different way. So I think, and I said to a publisher, I've mentioned this too, I won't say any more than that, and I said that, look, I think this is, not only that it needs to be completely rewritten, but this is probably the way to need to do it. And the publishers come back saying, we love that idea. So that's nice. So maybe I'm tied to the desk for another few years now. There's nothing committed in writing yet, but there's.
You can always count with Instituto Cervantes Library. Anybody can. It's for anybody to use our library, Gabriela Mistral, here in Instituto Cervantes in Sydney, and the online library of Instituto Cervantes network worldwide is always for your use or for anybody's, if you may. Well, I will be awaiting that.
I couldn't recommend it more. Yeah.
Well, I think it would be great if somebody would want, yes, any questions?
Yes, love to have some questions.
But all of this, by the way, yes, so this will be posted, of course, online, as we usually do, because there's many people that would like to be here that it's not always possible. So we will also have interaction and questions there.
Sure.
But here, if anybody would like to do any questions.
There's one. Rob down the back has a question.
Thank you. The subtitle is a new biography.
Yes.
As a biography, I've talked to people who've written biographies, and they often find, as they do a lot of research, they discover things about their subject that they didn't know about, and it can put a whole new light on how they view that subject.
Yes.
Was that your experience in this case?
Yes, absolutely it was. Absolutely it was. It's funny you mentioned that, Rob. I'll just give you one example. There's a thing in medieval Spain called a fuero, and a fuero is like a how would you call it? Like a local rules of local governance, like a charter. Yeah. And you know how the English, are very proud of their Magna Carta, King John 1215, and so on. And looking through the history of Madrid, Madrid had a very famous fuero in 1202, and I read a translation of that. Well, it was translated from Latin into contemporary Spanish, and it's just the most incredible document, because basically it says, it's these page after page after page, which lays out, these are the rules. If you want to live in Madrid, these are the things you can do, these are the things you can't do, these are the things you must not do. And it goes into all the details of things like, when you butcher a pig, this is where you have to put the entrails and so on and so forth. And if you can carry these kind of weapons, but not these other kind of weapons, and you can use these swear words, but you can't use these swear words. It's just a fascinating document, And one of the things that I found that I thought was really, really interesting was the document had a thing which was called I think I've got this word right, I think a chrismom, and I had to look up the word, what is that? And it's kind of like a medieval fine print. It's a sort of little bit that they add at the end of a document. And this one, the Madrid Fuero, had this chrismom, and then it said, one of the most serious violations which shall be punishable with death is anyone who commits an act of sexual violence against a woman. And I thought, that's incredible to read that in the year 1202, when you see how that's, such a, obviously don't have the death penalty nowadays, but we see how with so much social awareness of that kind of issue, you see, wow, 820 years ago, people were highlighting that in a sort of charter of rules of how to live in this town. That fascinated me. So to read those medieval documents sometimes could be a bit of a chore, but other times they just throw up the most marvelous information. Yeah. There was, sorry, Rob, there was a lot of other things as well, but that was just one that came to mind. Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about changes over time in how the people of Madrid have viewed their own city?
Yes, that's a really, really interesting topic, and I do talk about it a little bit in the book. I think when you go to the record, there's not a lot of evidence of people in Madrid being aware of their own city until probably the 20th century, in the sense that the material that's written about Madrid was either written by travellers, tourists, diplomats, or novelists and poets and so on. But the common people having an opinion about the city, it doesn't really exist. Right? I have a very, very good friend who was born in the 1960s in Madrid. He's a senior journalist with the El País newspaper, and he was telling me he was born he grew up in an area of Madrid called San Blas, which is it was very much a working class suburb on the eastern side of Madrid. And I remember him telling me how, when he was growing up, this was one of these areas on the edge of Madrid where they were putting up these high-rise places, and there was just dirt and no trees around. It was a very kind of barren environment. And he was saying how, and I mentioned this in the book, how he said, for our parents, and of course there was a great influx of people from all around Spain coming into Madrid in the 1950s and 1960s for work opportunities. And he said, well, like my parents who are from Soria or from Avila or Salamanca or Zamora or wherever, Cuenca, you say those people, they came and they had their local, like their customs, their traditions, Oh, we're from Cuenca, we're from Zamora. These are the things that we do and what we believe in. And he said, for people like me, what did we have? We're from this place called San Blas, which was this kind of crappy suburb and so there's a kind of feeling of kind of being without roots or without having a sort of a strong cultural background. That's in the 1960s. From the late 1980s, things started changing. There was a campaign by the socialist mayor called Juan Barranco, I think his name was, in the late 80s, and it was called Madrid, Claro que sí. And it was kind of a thing to say, hey, listen, Madrid, look around. You actually live in a great city, right? And it was really from the late 80s when that started to take, I mean, the Movida probably helped, but from that point on. But Madrid people, and we were making a joke about this before, weren't we? Madrid people are often held in low esteem by other people from around Spain who consider them arrogant and a bit unbearable. Right? I don't find people from Madrid like that, but people from other parts of Spain. So there's that kind of, oh yes, we're from Madrid kind of thing. I think nowadays, people are very, very proud of their city, and they're very aware of what an incredible place it actually is. That doesn't take away from the fact, though, that there are also a lot of people who understand that in Madrid, for example, I mean, nowadays, this housing is, there's a real crisis with housing. There's a real issue with what they call the massification of tourism in the city centre. Basically, all the old apartments being turned into Airbnbs and so on. So, I mean, that's great for the financial of the city, but it means that the character of the inner city is changing, and so not everyone's happy with that. So, but people, I think, in Madrid, very, very aware and very, very proud of their city. Yeah. I don't know many people from Madrid who talk the city down. They might talk down, Spanish people always do this, they'll talk down one political party or another, right? But they won't necessarily talk down their city. They might say, oh, this so-and-so, this politician's doing a useless job of our city, and then someone else will say it about the other side, but that's just a political argument. It's not actually about the nature of the city.
Sometimes it takes for you to be outside and far away.
Yes.
To get to value and be honored of the place for you. The only thing that maybe Madrileños, just myself, do not like of our city are the traffic jams.
Yes.
Every time there's a remodel, when they're trying to remodulate an area, which I've seen, and I see the final outcome, which is wonderful, such as Las Torres Quillo in the northern part of Madrid. It was all very low housing, and suddenly they put 3 or 4 skyscrapers, which are beautiful and very modern. But I suffered the whole process of that being made, and we all had to go through that road to get into Madrid. And it was so, from that point of view, from Madrileños, we're not as happy as, and to be honest, as a Madrileña, and my mother's from Galicia, and so I have family all over the place from Spain. They usually didn't like us Madrileños because in summer it's very hot, incredibly hot, and we don't have sea or a beach, so we go elsewhere. And in Spain, vacations is in August, and for several decades, everything. Don't try to write to a Spaniard in August because they won't answer. Everybody's on vacation from the 1st of August to the 31st. So all the Madrileños went to
the coast.
And so suddenly, and we're very loud. We like to, and we're very nice, of course, but we're very loud. And so sometimes, people that are from there saying, oh, here they come again. But because we all came at the same time, I think it's more of that. But can't really do anything about it, but how it is. And I love my hometown, and I love my country.
Yes. I think the vast majority of people from Madrid are very, very proud of their hometown.
Another question?
Yeah. Any tips for first-time visitors?
what do you have in mind? What's like for a week, for a day? 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Oh, okay. Soon. Look, I'd say in Madrid, I always recommend people. I mean, of course, you've got to. People generally go to Madrid for the famous museums, and you can't miss them. That's very, very important, of course. But Madrid has a couple of other things. It has some lesser known museums which are fantastic, absolutely fantastic, and some of them are mentioned in the book. Right? Museums of decorative arts and so on. There's one or two collections which have been left by very, very wealthy people in the 19th, early 20th centuries have left these sort of small palace buildings with all their collections. And it's not just Spanish, it's, Arabic stuff, Chinese stuff. There are some incredible collections in Madrid. And Madrid also has really beautiful parks, which a lot of people don't realise because, some people go, oh, Madrid's this city without trees. That's absolute nonsense. Madrid has really beautiful parks, and it's well worth spending time in some of the lovely parks, particularly not just the Retiro, which is essential, but also the parks down and around below the Royal Palace are really lovely places. Walk along the river nowadays, it's very pleasant, and there's bird life, and there's fish back in the river, it's fantastic. So there's lots and lots of places, and also you can walk around. I mean, central Madrid has so many interesting streets and districts, from Malasaña and Chueca and up into a district which I personally love called Chamberí, and it's very sort of beautiful 19th century apartment buildings. It was one of the first when they started extending the old cities with the sort of the grid plan streets, as they did, of course, in Barcelona. That was the first one in Spain. But then they did a couple of different areas in Madrid, and one of them was this area called Chamberí, so you just go and walk around those places. And there are other areas now. There's a street called Ponzano, which is, back in the day, I used to live on that street in the late 80s for a little, not for long actually, because something happened with the lease on the flat, but it was kind of like a pretty ordinary, nothing street. It's become this absolute centre of gastronomy, and isn't it, So there's so much to see nowadays, so much. So just wander around the centre, yeah.
And eat your way through.
Yes, eat your way, absolutely. Absolutely, yes.
Well, without further ado, I must agradecer, thank
you.
Sorry, Luke, once again, because having an Australian have such in-depth knowledge of Madrid and saying such lovely things with detail. It's not just, I was there once and I met a couple of people that were wonderful to me. It's a long-lasting relationship with the city. There's a lot of studying and in-depth information,
yes.
and it's incredible how an Australian can have such an insight on a city that I have lived there for so long, and it's wonderful to hear you, to read how you talk about it, and to outreach to the Australian public. There is so much effort in what Instituto Cervantes does, my colleague John, myself, but it goes much further. When you talk about it, when you write about it, you should be definitely paid by the government.
Well, people in the government, so.
Because of what he does, it's so important. We have a tourism office, we have a commerce office, we have education of, course, an embassy, a consulate, and so many companies from Madrid that are here based in Australia. But it goes without saying that your written word and this book launch is such an honor for the city, and such an honor for us that it's un placer. It's a pleasure to have you here once again, and it's an honor to be part of this, even if it's just a tiny little bit.
Thank you so much, Coral. Can I just say, outside of, how can I put this, outside of humans, Madrid, that's the most important relationship I've had in my life, so definitely. I've got to put human relationships first, but apart from that, my relationship to Madrid is absolutely the most important relationship of my life, yeah.
Must have been hard to be out of not being able to visit.
Very hard.
During the COVID, I mean.
Very hard, yeah. And I really do feel when I go back there, and it doesn't matter where I am, I feel in my bones a way that I rarely feel anywhere else. I feel this is my place. this is my place. I just love this place, you know. Yeah.
We had a wonderful cerveza with chips and stuff and El Retiro
That's
after
right.
the,
We did.
the
we did.
launch of the Spanish book, and it was wonderful. And it was out of the blue one of the most extraordinary and weird moments. I said, look at this Australian guy in El Retiro. My grandmother lived there for 90 years, and here we are talking about this book. And yeah, so it's wonderful to be part of this. It's wonderful what you've written. And what is also in English and what is translated in Spanish. And it's definitely a wonderful honor for the city of Madrid, and we're very lucky to have you here and to have you in writing. Mucha suerte, very good luck
Gracias.
for this launch of the book, and por muchos años más. May our professional relationship be everlasting as it has been in the past few years.
Muchísimas
Thank you so
gracias,
much.
Coral. Muchísimas gracias. And thank you, everyone, for coming along tonight as well, please. Thank you so much. As Coral said, we haven't even barely touched the surface of, you know, inevitably with years of work and research and stuff, and there's a lot of stuff in the book, so I hope you enjoy it. It's officially launched, yes, absolutely.